Yeah, it's a little weird. I'm used to speaking to this group in my role as senior associate dean, not as paleontologist. But I think I can do both. So as a little background, my journey into paleontology started with a question that was actually asked a few years before I was born, and asked by a person that I never met. In 1973, Harold Urey published a paper in Nature. He's a Nobel laureate in chemistry. And he asked, what if the extinction of the dinosaurs was caused by a comet impact? At the time, his paper and his question about the 66-million-year-old mystery were largely ignored. But a few years later, a young geologist from across the bay in Berkeley, Walter Alvarez, discovered high concentrations of the element iridium in sediments deposited at the time of the mass extinction event and now exposed near the town of Gubbio in Italy. And these data could only be explained by an asteroid impact event. The amount of iridium suggested that the asteroid was about 10 kilometers across, and it would have been moving at 10 to 20 kilometers per second when it hit the Earth. It would have exploded upon impact with an energy release similar to the world's entire nuclear arsenal, multiplied 500,000 times. And it left a crater. And this isn't it. This is the Barringer crater in Arizona, which formed about 50,000 years ago. And it's a bit less than a mile across, about the size of the central Stanford campus. And so for context, right, if this is the Bay Area and the Central Valley, this little red dot here is the Barringer crater. Right? The anticipated crater for an impact hypothesized by Alvarez would be about this big. Right? It would run from Stanford campus out to about Sacramento. And the real crater was discovered about a decade later, in 1990, on the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. The ejecta would have heated the atmosphere like an oven for hours. Dust would have blocked out the sun for weeks, if not months. Animals died, plants burned. This was 1980 when the discovery was made, and my 5-year-old self was in the midst of his dinosaur phase, and I was hooked on extinction, right? So when I arrived in college and actually started to study geology, I took my first geology class and had my bubble burst a little bit. Right? This end Cretaceous extinction, it was one of the big 5 mass extinction events in Earth's history, but it wasn't the big one. Another extinction event at the end of the Permian period, 250 million years ago, so about 185 million years earlier than the end Cretaceous extinction, eliminated about half of animal families and about 80% of animal genera. And even better, at least as a scientist, we didn't know why. And so after a few post-college years as a high school teacher, I returned to graduate school to try to figure out what caused the end Permian mass extinction. And as a graduate student, I set off to South China, looking for an ancient example of something like the Bahamas today. And so this is an image from Google Maps of the Little Bahama Bank. This is about the right scale of the geological deposit that we're working on. But the difference being that thanks to the actions of plate tectonics, you could imagine a north-south cut right down the middle of Little Bahama Bank. Tectonics has folded and exposed the platform in cross-sections. So in map view, we can see all the way from the oldest to the youngest sediments on this platform. And here it is in South China. I don't know if the contrast is quite good enough to see, but from bottom left to upper right is the carbonate platform. It's the darker part of the image here, and then the lighter part of the image are the deeper water sediments that filled in around this platform. And the key thing is this orange rectangle in the top is part of the area that's been tectonically sliced in half, right, like a slice through a cake, and then tipped on its side. And so I'm going to show you another image which does have better contrast on this projector. And you'll see the upper right side of this rectangle will be at the bottom, lower left side will be at the top. And that gives us a right side up view of this carbonate platform in its current orientation. And so we have the bottom with the oldest rocks at the bottom of the image, the top with the youngest rocks at the top of the image. And you can actually see the ancient slope going from the top of this platform out into deep water. The water around this platform would have been more than 1 kilometer thick in the Middle Triassic when the platform finally stopped accumulating sediment. And this limestone was ideal for my mission because it's often made largely of the shells of animals and algae, providing direct evidence of biological change. And the limestone incorporates elements in their isotopes from seawater that reflect factors like temperature, oxygen availability, geochemical cycles, the delivery of nutrients. And so we can learn about environmental change at the same time that we're learning about biological evolution. So what I'll do next is show you an image. We'll get our boots down on the ground. So we'll be standing at the base of that red arrow, basically looking up along this escarpment surface that's been turned on its side, just for a sense of scale, right? And so what really amazed me as I hiked through these rocks with my collaborators, and these are kilometer-thick deposits of Permian and Triassic limestone, it wasn't so much the loss of biodiversity, which was there, it's real, but it was the loss of abundance and the permanence of that loss. And so Permian limestones are full of fossils. So here's one sample where we've cut it through and made it very, very thin so we can shine light through it. And we can see animals like crinoids and brachiopods, clams and snails, sponges. We can see algae that make hard shells. We can see protists like foraminifera. And then when we go to Triassic limestones, those are dominated by calcium carbonate mud. The shells are around, but they're small, they're hard to find. And it stayed this way for millions of years. All of the Permian corals and all of the calcifying algae on the planet went extinct. And a new kind of coral, the modern reef-building scleractinians, evolved about 5 million years after this event. At the same time, the new calcareous algae species started to appear. And our platform covers the first 15 million years after the extinction. So in fact, we see these events happening as we walk through the rocks. The change at the end of the Permian was abrupt. Immediately after the mass extinction event, bacterial mat deposits formed on the seafloor. And you can see that here as the darker, more mottled rocks overlying a lighter colored fossil-rich layer of sediment that was deposited immediately before the extinction event. These microbialites are often about 20 meters thick and accumulated over a few 100,000 years. And so I brought a display item. So you can pass this around. I think it's big enough that no one will walk off with it accidentally. It's heavy too, I think. Well,
you think I'm not strong.
We're good. So you can pass this around. This is the worst thing that happened in the last 500 million years. And so you get a chance to see, hopefully everyone can see the microbialites, the sort of splotchy part on the top of the sample. And it would have been something like this, right? This is a bleached coral in the modern ocean, which after it died and bleached on the left, on the right became covered in algal and microbial slime. And the difference being that at the end of the Permian, this played out globally and lasted for longer than the existence of our species on the planet to date. The earliest few 100,000 years of the Triassic was a slime world. And why was that, right? And this is where the isotopes come in. Over the past 20 years, quite a number of research groups, including my own, have measured isotope ratios in Permian and Triassic rocks. And we've seen, for example, that oxygen isotopes indicate dramatic global warming on the scale of about 10 degrees Celsius and lasting for hundreds of thousands to a few million years. Working with collaborators, I've measured calcium isotopes in these kinds of limestone samples, and we see evidence of ocean acidification. And Kimberly Lau, a PhD student who worked here at Stanford with Kate Maher and me, measured uranium isotope ratios in these samples and found evidence for a dramatic decrease in the oxygen content of seawater at the time of the Permian extinction. And so high temperatures, ocean acidification, and ocean deoxygenation are referred to by modern conservation biologists as the deadly trio. And they're referred to this way because these are the big three physiological stresses that marine animals are facing in the modern oceans. Together, they likely explain the prolonged devastation of Triassic ecosystems. And in the Permian case, we think that we understand why this happened. There was the eruption of a very large volcanic province in Siberia called the Siberian Traps. And we know from radiometric age dating that these traps were erupting right at the time of extinction. Based on analyses of rock samples from the traps and from around the traps, we know that they released enormous amounts of gas into the atmosphere, including enough carbon dioxide that it would be at least 4 or 5 times the total fossil fuel reserves on the planet today. And so this led us to wonder, what if the 21st century is in some sense a repeat of the Permian extinction? And so to answer that question, I've been working with students and collaborators more recently to merge the past with the future. We start with the fossil record and ask what kinds of patterns it contains, and then in addressing those questions, we're able to assess what potential causes of the extinction were. And so what we've done with collaborators recently is to build climate models constrained by our isotope data. And we've used these, along with physiological data from experiments on living species, to successfully predict the latitude gradient of extinction in the Permian Ocean, as well as migration patterns after the extinction. And initially, our goal was really just to test whether the end Permian extinction could be explained by the combined effects of warming and ocean oxygen loss. And that does appear to be the case. We're hoping to add ecological interactions to these models. But what we've realized most recently is that we can use these results actually to calibrate at scale predicted extinction and biogeographic migration under a range of carbon emission scenarios for the next 2 centuries. So we can take anthropogenic forcing scenarios, put those into climate models, and test what we think the biodiversity responses will be to the carbon forcing event, to the forcing functions. And the importance of this is that we need, as you can recognize, we need data from laboratory experiments. We need data from field studies. But getting data at scale is essentially impossible other than from the fossil record. We don't have another planet to run experiments on to find out what happens at a planetary scale for environmental changes of this nature. And so the fossil record ultimately, it seems to me, isn't just a source of awe and wonder, as it was for my 5-year-old self. It can also help us anticipate the outcomes of current actions and avoid worst-case scenarios. To start closing up, I think the specifics of the research that we've done are new, right? They're unknown and were probably unknowable to Yuri and Alvarez. I think they were even unknown and unknowable to me when I started graduate school, or even when I started at Stanford, right? Some of the measurements we're making, the technology didn't exist when I started my faculty position. But the orientation of doing the work this way actually goes back to the origins of modern geology. James Hutton was an 18th century Scottish geologist, and he visited the rocks shown here at Siccar Point in Scotland. And what he recognized was that the rock layers in the foreground must have been deposited flat on the bottom of a body of water, probably an ocean. They must have been tilted, uplifted, eroded. And then we can see where the person is walking in the upper left that there's another set of sediments, right? And so in fact, there must have been, after this erosion, another event where this was flooded. More sediments were deposited on top of this. Then the whole thing was tilted and eroded to form the modern Siccar Point. And Hutton actually had 2 insights from this, right? The first one is the more trivial, which is the Earth must be really old. And these processes have been going on for a very long time to form these kinds of deposits because you can't see them happening in real time today. The more radical insight that he had was that these processes probably are happening today. They're just too slow to perceive. But that by understanding what must have happened in the geological past, he could imagine what a geologist 10 million, 100 million, 500 million years in the future would see if they were on this planet. And he wrote, in tracing those operations which are past, we foresee distant events in the course of things. And just modifying Hutton a little bit, I want to ask, what if in tracing those operations which are past, we can foresee and change distant events in the course of things? I think that is the motivation with which we launched the Doerr School. We haven't caused anything close to the magnitude of an end Permian environmental change or ecosystem collapse yet, and we don't have to. And I honestly don't know what the future will bring for the planet or even for my own research. What excites me most are the unanticipated opportunities to learn more about Earth's past and to put the past to use in creating a better future. And I hope that those of you in the audience who can see better than I can how to use your skills in geology and engineering, biology, oceanography, economics, sociology, and other disciplines. I hope that you'll be excited to work with me to help create a brighter future, because I don't think the Anthropocene needs to end up being the next early Triassic.